Welcome to a discussion on modernization and globalization. All through its historical journey, human societies have encountered a lot of social changes, technological transformation, cultural rejuvenation, and also economic rejuvenation. These are widely caused by a variety of events and revolution like those of technological advancement, new discoveries, revolution in human thoughts like those of Renaissance, Reformation, Enlightenment, and also with the expansion of varieties of social processes like those of colonialism, modernization, westernization, and globalization. However, none of these social processes are discrete, rather they are interlinked. At times, many of these social processes coexist together, though in a modified form. Notwithstanding all those varieties of coexistence, the impact of globalization and modernization in the contemporary world has been those of galloping, as these are multi-layered, multidimensional, and multifaceted. Though India is a vast country, it is having the impact of modernization, globalization, and westernization in diverse facets in diverse areas. To discuss the interlinkages among modernization and globalization, and what are the intertwinings of these processes with those of other social developmental sector in the country, we are having among us today Professor T.K. Oman. Professor T.K. Oman, a doyen of Indian sociology. He was the president of International Sociological Society, president of Indian Sociological Society, also a Padma Bhushan awardee. I, on behalf of the sociology faculty of Indira Gandhi National Open University, and on my personal behalf, welcome Professor T.K. Oman to the studio today. Welcome, sir. I will start with a very small kind of question to Professor T.K. Oman. So, now that we are talking about in sociology or also in regular discourse about modernization and globalization, will you please explain what are the conceptual reality of these two concepts and these two categories in present day world?
Well, you have posed a rather tricky question, although it would appear to be simple. Modernization ought to be understood as a temporal and globalization as a spatial social process. Let me amplify. All societies were non-modern or traditional at some point in time. Some of them underwent the process of modernization earlier as compared with others. For example, European and Western societies were modernized earlier than Asian or Eastern societies. Therefore, many analysts think that modernization began in the West and spread to the rest of the world. But this is a wrong way of looking at things, because as I said, if we take a temporal view of modernization, it becomes clear that all societies are likely to move from their traditional or non-modern past to the modern present. Now, however, there are historical reasons why the West experienced modernity first. The most important of this was industrialization, and in turn this meant industrial revolution occurred there first. That is why modernization is often defined as the progressive displacement of animate energy with inanimate energy. That is, technology is a crucial dimension of modernization. Some people even argue that globalization is nothing but late modernity. But I don't think this is a correct perspective, because as I hinted in the beginning, globalization is a spatial process, and communication, particularly satellite communication, is the most crucial aspect. Here, communication is instant and quick. To put it conceptually, modernization is something which happens sequentially in all societies, but in the case of globalization, it is simultaneous. That which is happening in one part of the world can spread simultaneously to the rest of the world. But your question the above is about modernization and globalization as social processes. For this, we need to understand their different dimensions. Modernization implies two vital social processes: one, structural differentiation, and two, the onward march of rationality. Generally speaking, in non-modern or traditional societies, structural differentiation was absent. For example, the priest could also be the medical man, whereas in modern society somebody looks after the spiritual needs of the community, whereas somebody else or set of other persons look after what may be called the material and other welfare of the people. Similarly, the landlord in a traditional society, that is a rich man, could also be a politically powerful person. But in a modern society, you find the rich are not necessarily politically powerful, and the politically powerful may often be poor, which is to say there is a differentiation and division of labor between the various categories. This is what we usually refer to as structural differentiation in sociology. The second aspect of modernization I refer to is the onward march of rationality. In non-modern societies, people rarely questioned irrational beliefs and practices, and they readily followed what is called custom. It is said custom was the king. But in a modern society, there is a tendency to interrogate existing past irrational practices, and therefore you will find that rationality becomes an important element of modern society. What I want to suggest is that the two things, structural differentiation and rationality, in combination would produce modernization. And it is very important to underline here, in India, in pre-modern India, there was an elaborate division of labor because of the caste system. A wide variety of occupations existed, but people did not question the ideology behind that structural differentiation or division of labor based on caste. And therefore, although we had structural differentiation, India did not become a modern society, but only when people started questioning that. That means when rationality was institutionalized and internalized, we really try to move towards modernity. That is, to conclude or to put succinctly, unless we have these two elements of social processes of structural differentiation and rationalization coexist, it will be extremely difficult to think in terms of the modernization process.
Okay. Now, how to link the modernization process with the globalization?
As I indicated, if you remember, some people think that globalization is nothing but late modernity. But if you look at sociology as a discipline as we know it today, it emerged in the West, and it was the West in which sociology emerged was an industrializing and modernizing West. And very frequently it is said sociology is the child of modernity in the West. But Western sociology, therefore at that point in time, was mainly concerned with what is called the industrial man. In contrast, sociology is a colonial transplant in India. It came to us, modern sociology, through the at the time of colonization, and therefore we could not have really thought in terms of sociology as an endeavor which deals with industrialization and industrial man. Of course, India was predominantly agrarian, and therefore Indian sociology by and large to begin with looked at agrarian India. Rural India was the main area of concern, but as we started industrializing, certainly we also started to look at urban India. So you will find in a sense Indian sociology is more holistic, I would say, as compared with the Western sociology, which confined its attention only to the urban industrial scene. We dealt with both the urban and rural scenes. Given the fact that rural India was constituted mainly by villages, and within that family, caste and religion were the core institutions, the life was very much conditioned by these institutions. Sociologists or Indian sociology focused on these institutions. But as I said, as industrialization and urbanization became important and visible, urban India too came to be under the lens of sociology. However, some of the very important dimensions were left out by Indian sociologists. Let me mention a couple of them. First of all, the emergence of India as an independent country or a polity was out of the womb of what is called the anti-colonial movement. Now, anti-colonial movement was perhaps the biggest of all movements of this kind in human history. But yet, you will find Indian sociologists rarely studied social movements until recently, say until the 1970s. Or a large number of modern occupations and professions have been introduced into Indian society through the route of colonization. Think of allopathic medicine, engineering and all the rest. But Indian sociologists did not really study the impact of Indian social structure on these professions or vice versa, the intertwinings between these two. And therefore, Indian sociology had attended to the problems which have been thrown up by modernization, but I would say rather gradually. Whereas globalization is a different cup of tea. Globalization, as we understand it today, started roughly by about 1980s in our part of the world, and by 1990s it became what is called the structural adjustment program, and there the economists were mainly concerned with it because it was economic reform, and the political scientists were also concerned with it because of the retreat of the state. So economy or market and state or polity were the two central players in the context of globalization. But sociologists entered the field little later by looking at civil society. So obviously some sociologists have started studying civil society, and some books have been published. But one deficit again we have to see here is that the impact of globalization on culture. A whole lot of things have happened because of globalization on our traditional culture, but how exactly it is moving, in what direction? Just to give you one example, hybridization. I mean, if you go to an Indian restaurant and ask for a hamburger, certainly you will get hamburger, but without any harm. The point is that this nuances of cultural globalization is yet to be fully explored in Indian society.
I'll come back to this again, that parts of this first question that you have narrated that sociology emerged out of the whole process of this modernization. Now we are living in an age of globalization, and sociology is interacting as an analytical discipline, trying to make a comprehensive understanding of the whole processes.
Yes.
So along with the process of globalization, we are also knowing the terms of localization and so many other related kind of concepts.
That's right. That's right.
Now there are two processes. One is that has there been a process of indigenizing social sciences, especially sociology in Indian subcontinent? When you are talking about modernization, also a process of localization, that process is there. And number two, what has been the state of sociology now in addressing the whole process of globalization, which is spreading all parts of the country in different dimensions, in cultural life, in political life, in economic life. What has been our response in dealing with those kind of?
First, about the kind of changes that globalization is bringing about. See, right from the beginning, some or other, people thought that when modernization takes place, tradition will be displaced, what I call the displacement syndrome.
Yeah.
Actually, it never happened anywhere in the world. Part of the tradition will be retained, but part will be rejected. Similarly, it is not that we take on the entirety of modernity. Some aspects of modernization will be taken, some other aspects will be rejected. So, it is a kind of mutation that is taking place. Therefore, if you look at the processes which are taking place, they are one, pluralization. There has been an elaboration of the cultural context. Some of these things have disappeared, others have been added. So, instead of what the Western people normally thought a displacement process, what's happening in India is an accretion process. That is, some things are displaced, as I said, but some things are added. So, both displacement and accretion are taking place together. Then, because of globalization, there has been a loss of nerve, if I may use the term. Many people think that globalization is like an avalanche which is falling on us, and we are uprooted. And because of that, people start looking for the tradition. So, there is traditionalization which is taking place. The search for roots becomes very, very significant, because people think that we are uprooted because of this globalization. Then, as I already indicated, although in another context, hybridization process. This hybridization takes place because many a time people find it is much better to think in terms of the mutation of the old and the new, and through that mutation you evolve new things. So, it is not that globalization is simply displacing modernization, but these two, as you have indicated, modernization and globalization go hand in hand. But you also see there is a lot of load shedding, as it were. Some things are rejected, some things are accepted, and a new synthesis is being evolved. But how exactly sociology respond to this is, again, you will find very many new areas of development. If you have seen what is happening in the Indian Sociological Society, for example, in the last few years, or a little more than a decade, you will find diasporic studies have become very important. See, earlier what happened? Indian scholars went to those places where Indians have migrated overseas, made some studies and published it. Today, what's happening is the Indian diasporic community itself has become an object of study, and there is a large number of publications coming out of it. Methodologically, this is very significant, because earlier we Indians always studied ourselves. They from the West came under the aegis of what is called area studies, the Britishers, the Germans, or the Americans, and they came and studied something. So, we were looking at the same phenomenon, they from their angle and we from our angle. But today, the diasporic scholar who is there, an Indian who is a citizen of America or United States or United Kingdom, is right there. He is participating in that culture, but he also has an understanding of his home culture. So, he is looking at the Indian situation from there. So, you get a third perspective, which is to say, because of globalization, one gets different perspectives to look at the social processes which are taking place, and of course, there is some amount of confluence, but there is considerable amount of divergences. What the American or the Western see, how the native Indian who is here looking at the phenomenon, but the Indian who is settled abroad and he is a citizen there is looking at the problem. So this process in that sense has enriched our understanding of the social reality.
Now coming to that question of, you mentioned that till 1970s a good number of scholars of India rather avoiding, I'll use the term, avoiding to study social movements and other kind of a thing. Now that in the age of globalization there is an enormous kind of resistance culture at the grassroots. As you rightly pointed out, there has been a process of rediscovering the primordiality in terms of caste, ethnicity and other kind of thing. Now as there has been a kind of a hybridization of the culture, also a process of intermixing of several sociological perspectives. So do you foresee emergence of a new sociology to understand all these processes, all this intermixing between the culture, among the culture, all this process of going back to primordiality with some amount of secularization, all those varieties?
You see, when I referred to the fear that tradition is being eroded because of modernization and globalization, I have actually hinted at it. The Western understanding was, and probably the reality was, that when modernity came, tradition was completely sidetracked and disappeared. But Indian reality is quite different. And because of that, it is not that we are rediscovering primordiality. I mean, take a very simple example of people getting married. In the traditional context, what happened was everything was arranged through kin group, caste groups. But today, you have had this very interesting phenomenon of supervised dating, or getting your spouse or mate through advertisements in the newspapers. It's a very curious mixture of tradition and modernity. It is not that dating as we understand in the West is really present here, but we have invented it in such a manner that tradition and modernity are coalescing, combining into one, and therefore a new pattern of behavior is emerging out of it. To that extent, sociologists ought to be alert and alive to these processes and studying them.
Thank you. Just very briefly, I want a very sharp kind of your response to this. As you pointed out, a kind of a shift in the societal scenario, a kind of also emergence of a new perspective from the sociological literature. So, in this backdrop, is it necessary and feasible to develop something called Indian perspective to understand society?
You see, I have very frequently talked about and even written about what is called contextualization of Indian sociology. I do not think that there is or there can be a universal sociology. No. I also don't think that there can be what is called a purely nationalistic sociology, because nation states as we understand them today are very artificial entities. But I have argued for civilizational sociology. So there may not be an Indian sociology, because India is at the moment a political entity, a republic, which has several limitations when we look at it sociologically. But if you look at South Asia as a civilization, then I find there is a prospect of developing a civilizational sociology, as much as the Westerners have developed a European perspective on sociology, but not so much an Indian sociology.
Thank you, Professor Ruman, for sparing your valuable time and making a whole elaboration in a very lucid way, the interlinkages between modernization and globalization, its different facets, its impact on Indian society, also the state of sociology under its own impact, and the possibility of having something, a civilizational sociology and contextual sociology, rather than locating a kind of a Indian sociology as you were talking about. Thank you very much for coming over here. Thank you very much, sir.